"Don't sign that paper," the homeless black boy said, and the CEO looked at him in total panic. The crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across the marble floor of the Meridian Hotel's grand ballroom, their light reflecting off champagne glasses and diamond jewelry. The air hummed with the soft murmur of Manhattan's elite, investment bankers in $1,000 suits, tech moguls with their perfectly styled hair, and reporters clutching their cameras like weapons of battle. Tonight wasn't just another corporate gathering. Tonight was history in the making. Arthur Keene stood at the center of it all, his silver hair perfectly combed, his navy suit tailored to perfection. At 52, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had built an empire from nothing. Noventus Technologies, his baby, his legacy, was about to become the most valuable tech company in the world. The merger with Quantum Dynamics would create a behemoth worth $47 billion. $47 billion. The number still made his head spin. "Ladies and gentlemen," Arthur's voice boomed through the microphone, cutting through the chatter like a knife through silk. "Tonight we make history." The crowd erupted in applause. Camera flashes lit up the room like fireworks. Arthur smiled, but his hands trembled slightly as he reached for the golden pen lying beside the thick contract. 2 years of negotiations, countless sleepless nights, and endless boardroom battles had led to this moment. One signature. One simple signature, and everything would change. Behind him, the 12-foot projection screen displayed the Noventus logo alongside Quantum Dynamics, with the words, "The future starts now," blazing in bold letters. The board members sat at the head table, their faces glowing with anticipation. Margaret Chin, the CFO, nodded encouragingly. David Walsh, the head of operations, raised his champagne glass in a silent toast. Even the usually stoic Richard Blackwood, chairman of the board, allowed himself a rare smile. Arthur lifted the pen, its weight feeling heavier than it should. The contract lay open before him, page after page of legal jargon that would reshape the tech industry forever. He had read every word, scrutinized every clause, approved every detail. This was his masterpiece. "Before I sign," Arthur said, his voice carrying across the silent room, "I want to thank everyone who made this possible. Our shareholders, our employees, our partners." Meanwhile, 3 floors below in the service alley behind the Meridian Hotel, 13-year-old Tariq Williams pressed himself against the cold brick wall, his stomach growling so loudly he was sure the entire city could hear it. The December wind cut through his thin jacket like ice, and his worn sneakers, 2 sizes too big and held together with duct tape, squelched in the dirty slush. He had been living on the streets for 6 months now, ever since the landlord had finally kicked him out of the tiny apartment he'd shared with his mother. The social workers had tried to place him in foster care, but Tariq had other plans. He wasn't going to be just another number in the system. He had something important to do first. The hotel's service entrance stood slightly ajar, warm golden light spilling out like honey. Tariq could smell the food from here: roasted chicken, fresh bread, something sweet and chocolatey. His mouth watered. He had learned the schedules of most high-end hotels in the area. Staff usually took their breaks around this time, and security was focused on the main event upstairs. Tariq adjusted the worn backpack on his shoulders, feeling the weight of the folder inside. His most precious possession. His father's final gift. He slipped through the service door like a shadow, his small frame allowing him to move unnoticed through the maze of service corridors. The sounds of the party grew louder as he climbed the service stairs, following the scent of food and the murmur of voices. His heart pounded, but not from fear. From purpose. Back in the ballroom, Arthur was reaching the climax of his speech. "This merger represents more than just business," he declared, his voice filled with passion. "It represents innovation, progress, and the American dream itself." The crowd was hanging on his every word. Investors leaned forward in their seats. Reporters scribbled frantically in their notepads. The atmosphere was electric, charged with the anticipation of witnessing a historic moment. Arthur placed the pen on the paper, right above the signature line. The cameras focused on his hand, capturing every detail for posterity. This image would be on the front page of every major newspaper tomorrow. The man who created the largest tech merger in history. But just as Arthur began to press the pen down, a commotion erupted at the back of the room. A server had dropped a tray of champagne glasses, the sound of shattering crystal echoing through the ballroom like a gunshot. Heads turned. Security moved toward the disturbance. And that's when Tarek made his move. He had been hiding behind the serving station, watching, waiting for the perfect moment. The dropped tray wasn't an accident. He had bumped into the server deliberately, creating the distraction he needed. Now, as all eyes turned toward the back of the room, Tarek stepped out from behind the table. His appearance was jarring against the backdrop of luxury. His clothes were 3 sizes too big, clearly donated items from some charity bin. His shoes were held together with tape. His hair was uncut and messy. But his eyes burned with a fierce intelligence that seemed to cut through the glittering facade of the room. "Don't sign that paper!" Tarek's voice cracked as he shouted, his adolescent vocal cords struggling with the volume needed to reach the front of the room. But every word was clear, every syllable sharp as a blade. The ballroom fell silent. Not the polite quiet of an attentive audience, but the absolute, crushing silence of 300 people simultaneously holding their breath. Arthur's hand froze over the contract, the pen hovering inches from the signature line. Security guards immediately began moving toward the boy, their hands reaching for their radios. But Tarek stood his ground, his small frame somehow commanding the attention of everyone in the room. "I said don't sign that paper," he repeated, his voice stronger now, more confident. "You don't know what you're doing." Arthur stared at the boy, his mind racing. Who was this kid? How had he gotten past security? And why did his voice sound so familiar, like an echo from a nightmare Arthur had been trying to forget? The reporters had turned their cameras on Tarek now, sensing a story. The board members were whispering furiously among themselves. Margaret Chin was already on her phone, probably calling for additional security. But Arthur couldn't move. Something about the boy's eyes, the determined set of his jaw, the way he stood there in his ragged clothes like he owned the room, it triggered a memory Arthur had buried deep. "Son," Arthur said, his voice carefully controlled, "this is a private event. You shouldn't be here." But Tarek didn't back down. Instead, he reached into his backpack and pulled out a manila folder, its edges worn and frayed. Even from across the room, Arthur could see the familiar logo on the folder's cover. Noventus Technologies. Arthur's blood ran cold. His hand began to shake, the pen nearly slipping from his fingers. The room was still silent, but now it felt different. Not expectant, but dangerous. Like the moment before a storm breaks. "My name is Tarek Williams," the boy said, his voice carrying clearly across the marble floor. "And I think you knew my father." The collective intake of breath from the crowd was audible. Arthur felt the world tilt on its axis. Williams. The name hit him like a physical blow. His vision blurred for a moment, and he had to grip the edge of the table to steady himself. Because he did know that name. He knew it all too well. And if this boy was who Arthur thought he was, then everything, the merger, the celebration, his carefully constructed future, was about to come crashing down. The security guards were already halfway across the ballroom, their black suits cutting through the crowd like sharks through water. Arthur watched them approach the boy, but something in his gut told him to wait. Something about the way Tarek held that folder, the confidence in his stance despite his obvious hunger and exhaustion. It reminded Arthur of someone he tried very hard to forget. "Wait!" Arthur's voice cut through the tension like a whip crack. The security guards froze mid-step. "Let the boy speak." Margaret Chin leaned forward from her seat at the head table, her face twisted with concern. "Arthur, we need to handle this situation quickly. The cameras are recording everything," Arthur finished, his eyes never leaving Tarek. "Which is exactly why we need to hear what he has to say." Tarek straightened his shoulders, clutching the folder against his chest like a shield. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears, but he had come too far to back down now. He had practiced this moment 1,000 times in the abandoned warehouse where he'd been sleeping, rehearsing the words his mother had made him memorize before she died. "My dad was Elijah Mercer," Tarek said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. The effect was immediate and devastating. Richard Blackwood's champagne glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the marble floor. Margaret Chen's face went white as paper. David Walsh actually stood up from his chair, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. But it was Arthur's reaction that confirmed everything Tarek needed to know. The CEO's face cycled through a dozen emotions in the span of seconds: shock, fear, guilt, and something that looked almost like relief. Arthur knew exactly who Elijah Mercer was. "That's impossible," Margaret whispered, but her voice carried in the deadly silence of the room. "Elijah Mercer died 2 years ago. He didn't have any children. He had me," Tarek said, his voice growing stronger. "And he had a wife. My mom, Sarah Williams. She kept her maiden name when they got married because she was already established as a nurse. But I'm his son. I'm Elijah Mercer's son." The reporters were going crazy now, their cameras flashing like strobe lights. Arthur could hear them whispering furiously into their phones, already crafting headlines. But he couldn't focus on any of that. His mind was racing back 2 years, to a night he tried to erase from his memory. Elijah Mercer had been one of Noventus's most brilliant financial analysts. Young, ambitious, with an eye for detail that was both a blessing and a curse. He'd been working late one Thursday evening, going through the preliminary numbers for what would eventually become the Quantum Dynamics merger, when he'd discovered something that shouldn't have been there. Arthur remembered the phone call at 11:47 p.m. Elijah's voice, tight with excitement and fear. "Mr. Keene, I need to see you immediately. There's something wrong with the quantum projections. Something very wrong." Arthur had tried to dismiss him, to tell him it could wait until morning. But Elijah had been insistent. "Sir, if what I'm seeing is accurate, we're looking at massive fraud. The merger can't proceed. It just can't." "You're lying," Arthur said now, his voice barely above a whisper. "Elijah didn't have a family. He was single. He lived alone." Tarek's laugh was bitter, old beyond his 13 years. "That's what he told everyone at work. He kept his family secret because he was scared of what might happen to us if the wrong people found out what he knew. Turns out he was right to be scared." The boy opened the folder with shaking hands, revealing a stack of papers that looked official and important. Even from across the room, Arthur could see the Noventus letterhead, the familiar formatting of internal documents. "He came home that night," Tarek continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "October 15th, 2022. He was so excited, talking about how he'd found something big, something that would expose the truth. He said he was going to be a hero, that he was going to save the company from making a terrible mistake." Arthur felt like he was drowning. The walls of the ballroom seemed to be closing in. He could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. "He called you that night," Tarek said, pointing directly at Arthur. "I heard him on the phone. He said, 'Mr. Keene, I have proof. The quantum numbers are fake. They've been inflating their assets for years, and if we merge with them, we'll be liable for billions in fraud.'" The room erupted in whispers. Board members were frantically texting. Reporters were shouting questions. But Arthur could only stare at the boy, remembering that phone call, remembering how he dismissed Elijah's concerns as paranoia. "He died 3 days later," Tarek said, his voice breaking slightly. "Car accident, they said. Hit a tree on his way to work. But he was the most careful driver I knew. He never even got parking tickets." Margaret Chen stood up abruptly. "This is ridiculous. We all know Elijah's death was thoroughly investigated. It was an accident. A tragic accident. Was it?" Tarek challenged, his young voice carrying across the room with surprising authority. "Because I have his notes. I have his research. I have copies of everything he was going to show you, Mr. Keene. And I know why he really died." Arthur's world was crumbling. Every eye in the room was on him now, waiting for his response. The merger contract lay forgotten on the table, the golden pen rolling slowly toward the edge. Tarek's hands moved with surprising steadiness as he opened the worn folder, revealing its contents to the room. The papers inside were organized with the precision of a professional investigator, each document labeled, dated, and cross-referenced. For a 13-year-old boy, he handled the evidence with the skill of someone far older. "My father was obsessed with details," Tarek said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom. "He used to say that the truth was always hidden in the numbers, you just had to know where to look." Arthur watched in horror as the boy pulled out the first document, a spreadsheet that Arthur recognized immediately. It was Quantum Dynamics' asset report from 18 months ago, the one that had first caught Elijah's attention. But this version was different. It was covered in red ink, with notes scrawled in Elijah's distinctive handwriting. "Quantum Dynamics has been lying about their assets for 3 years," Tarek announced, holding up the paper so the cameras could see it. "They've been reporting fake patents, inflated real estate values, and phantom subsidiaries that don't actually exist. My dad figured it out." Margaret Chin shot to her feet. "This is preposterous. Our due diligence team spent months verifying Quantum's numbers. Every asset has been independently verified." "By who?" Tarek interrupted, pulling out another document. "By Pinnacle Verification Services? The same company that's owned by Quantum's sister corporation?" He held up a corporate filing that showed the connection. "My dad found that too." The room exploded in whispers. Arthur felt sick. He had personally approved Pinnacle as the verification company, trusting Margaret's recommendation. But looking at the document in Tarek's hands, the conflict of interest was obvious. "There's more," Tarek continued, his confidence growing with each revelation. He pulled out a thick stack of printed emails. "These are communications between Quantum's executives and your board members. They knew about the fake assets. They planned to hide the truth until after the merger was complete." Arthur's legs felt weak. He knew those emails. He had participated in some of those conversations. But how could a 13-year-old boy have access to internal company communications? "How did you get those?" David Walsh demanded, his face red with anger or fear. "Those are confidential corporate documents." Tarek's smile was sad but determined. "My dad was very thorough. He made copies of everything before he died. He knew something might happen to him, so he prepared for it. He gave everything to my mom, and she gave it to me." The boy reached deeper into the folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper that made Arthur's blood freeze. It was a letter, written on Noventus letterhead, with Arthur's name printed at the top. "This is a letter my dad wrote to you, Mr. Keene," Tarek said, his voice growing stronger. "He wrote it 3 days before he died. He never got the chance to send it." Arthur could see his own name on the letter, could make out fragments of text even from across the room. He remembered Elijah mentioning a formal report, a comprehensive analysis of the fraud. Arthur had told him not to bother, that they would handle it internally. "Dear Mr. Keene," Tarek began reading, his young voice carrying the weight of his father's words. "I am writing to formally notify you of serious financial irregularities I have discovered in the proposed Quantum Dynamics merger. The evidence I have compiled proves beyond doubt that Quantum has been systematically falsifying their financial records for the past 3 years." The room was dead silent. Even the reporters had stopped their frantic note-taking to listen. "I have identified 47 phantom assets totaling $3.2 billion in fake value," Tarek continued. "I have documented evidence of bribery, falsified audits, and conspiracy to commit securities fraud. If Noventus proceeds with this merger, we will be liable for billions in damages when the truth comes out." Arthur felt like he was having a heart attack. His chest was tight, his breathing shallow. Every word Tarek read was true. Arthur had known there were problems with the quantum numbers, had suspected something wasn't right. But he had chosen to ignore the warning signs because the merger was too important, too lucrative to abandon. "The letter ends with a warning," Tarek said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. My dad wrote, Mr. Keene, if you sign this merger knowing what I have told you, you will be personally responsible for the largest corporate fraud in American history. I am prepared to take this evidence to the SEC, the FBI, and the press if necessary. The truth must come out. Tarek folded the letter carefully and looked directly at Arthur. He wrote that letter on October 15, 2022. He died on October 18, 2022. 3 days later. Right before he was supposed to meet with federal investigators. The implications hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Richard Blackwood was frantically whispering into his phone. Margaret Chin looked like she might faint. The reporters were going crazy, their cameras flashing like lightning. But Arthur's attention was focused entirely on the boy standing at the back of the room. Elijah's son. The ghost of his own conscience made flesh. You knew, Tarek said, his voice carrying across the room with devastating clarity. You knew everything my father was going to tell you. And you let him die for it. Arthur's hand moved unconsciously toward the merger contract, the pen still lying beside it. The document that would make him billions. The same document that would trigger the federal audit that would expose everything. Everything Elijah had died trying to prevent. Arthur's face was a masterpiece of controlled terror. Years of boardroom battles and high-stakes negotiations had taught him to maintain his composure under pressure, but this was different. This was personal. This was the ghost of his past standing in ragged clothes, holding evidence that could destroy everything he had built. He forced his lips into what he hoped resembled a confident smile, though his hands were shaking so badly he had to clasp them behind his back. The cameras were still rolling, capturing every micro-expression, every bead of sweat that formed on his forehead despite the ballroom's cool temperature. Ladies and gentlemen, Arthur said, his voice surprisingly steady, I think we're all being a bit hasty here. This young man has clearly been through some difficult times, and perhaps his grief has led him to some unfortunate conclusions about his father's death. But even as he spoke, Arthur could see the doubt creeping into the faces around him. The investors who had been so eager to celebrate just minutes ago were now whispering among themselves, their champagne glasses forgotten on their tables. The reporters sensed blood in the water and were circling like sharks. Victoria Sterling, the head of Meridian Capital and one of Noventus's largest investors, stood up from her table near the front. At 65, she was known for her sharp mind and even sharper tongue. She had survived 3 market crashes and countless corporate scandals, and she could smell trouble from a mile away. Arthur, she said, her voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd like a blade. If there's even a 1% chance that what this boy is saying is true, you cannot sign that contract. If you do, and this comes out later, you're not just risking your company, you're risking every pension fund, every retirement account, every investment portfolio that has money tied up in this merger. Her words hit Arthur like a physical blow. Victoria controlled nearly $8 billion in assets, and her word carried enormous weight in the financial world. If she pulled her support, others would follow. Victoria, please, Arthur said, trying to maintain his composure. Let's not let emotions override logic here. This is a child making accusations based on documents he claims to have found. We don't even know if those papers are authentic. But Tarek was ready for that challenge. He pulled out his phone, a cracked, ancient model that looked like it had been dropped a dozen times, and began scrolling through photos. I photographed everything, he said, his voice clear and confident. Every email, every document, every piece of evidence my dad collected. I uploaded it all to multiple cloud storage accounts before I came here tonight. I even sent copies to journalists at the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal. The room erupted in chaos. Reporters began frantically calling their editors. Board members started arguing among themselves. Arthur felt like he was in a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. Margaret Chin grabbed Arthur's arm, her fingernails digging into his sleeve. Arthur, we need to get you out of here. Now. Before this gets any worse. But Arthur couldn't move. He was remembering that night 2 years ago, the night Elijah had called him. The conversation had lasted less than 10 minutes, but it had changed everything. Mr. Keene, I have proof that Quantum Dynamics has been falsifying their financial records for years. If we proceed with this merger, we'll be liable for billions in fraud charges. Elijah, you're being paranoid. Our due diligence team has verified everything. The numbers are solid. Sir, with respect, the due diligence team was lied to. I have the real numbers right here. We need to stop this merger immediately. Elijah, I appreciate your concern, but this deal is too important to abandon based on your suspicions. File a report if you want, but the merger proceeds as scheduled. Arthur had hung up the phone that night thinking he had handled the situation professionally. He had no idea he was signing Elijah's death warrant. Now, looking at Tariq's determined face, Arthur could see Elijah's eyes staring back at him. The same intelligence, the same moral conviction, the same refusal to back down when he knew he was right. You remember that phone call, don't you? Tariq asked, as if reading Arthur's thoughts. My dad told me about it. He said you dismissed his concerns without even looking at the evidence. Arthur's vision blurred. The room was spinning. He could feel 300 pairs of eyes boring into him, waiting for his response. If you sign that contract, Victoria Sterling said, her voice deadly quiet. Knowing what you know now, you will personally be responsible for the largest securities fraud in American history. Is that really how you want to be remembered? Arthur looked down at the merger contract, its pages gleaming white under the chandelier lights. The golden pen lay beside it, waiting. One signature would make him the most powerful man in the tech industry. One signature would also make him the most wanted man in America. The choice was his. But as he looked up at Tariq's face, he realized the choice had already been made 2 years ago, on October night when he had chosen greed over conscience. Now it was time to pay the price. Arthur's voice cut through the chaos like a knife. I need a moment, he announced, his words silencing the room. I need to speak with the boy privately. Margaret Chen's face went pale. Arthur, that's not advisable. We should have legal counsel present. No lawyers, Arthur said firmly, his eyes never leaving Tariq's face. Just me and him. 5 minutes. The board members exchanged worried glances. Victoria Sterling nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of the moment. The reporters protested loudly, but Arthur was already walking toward the back of the room, his expensive shoes clicking against the marble floor with each deliberate step. Tariq stood his ground, clutching the folder against his chest like armor. Despite his youth, despite his worn clothes and obvious hunger, he carried himself with a dignity that reminded Arthur painfully of his father. There's a conference room down the hall, Arthur said quietly when he reached the boy. We can talk there. Tariq nodded, following Arthur through a side door that led to a smaller, more intimate space. The conference room was elegant but simple, a mahogany table, leather chairs, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering lights of Manhattan. Arthur closed the door behind them, and suddenly the noise from the ballroom faded to a distant murmur. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Arthur stood by the window, his hands clasped behind his back, staring out at the city he had conquered. Tariq remained by the door, ready to run if necessary, but his young face showed no fear. How did you really get those documents? Arthur asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Tariq set the folder down on the conference table, his movements careful and deliberate. My dad was smart. He knew that if he found something this big, his life might be in danger. So he made copies of everything and gave them to my mom for safekeeping. Arthur turned around, studying the boy's face. And your mother? What happened to her? Pain flickered across Tariq's features. She got sick about a year after Dad died. Cancer. She couldn't afford the treatment, not with the medical bills and everything. She died 6 months ago. I'm sorry, Arthur said, and to his surprise he meant it. That must have been very difficult for you. Tariq's jaw tightened. She made me promise before she died. She said that Dad had died for the truth, and that I had to finish what he started. She said that good people had to stand up to bad people, or else the world would get darker and darker. Arthur felt a stab of guilt so sharp it took his breath away. This boy had lost both parents because of Arthur's greed and cowardice. He had been living on the streets, fighting for survival, while Arthur lived in luxury built on lies. "What do you want from me?" Arthur asked, his voice hoarse. Tarek stepped closer to the table, his eyes never leaving Arthur's face. "I don't want your money. I don't want revenge. I want justice." "Justice? I want you to tell the truth about my father. I want you to admit that he was a hero, not some crazy person who died in a car accident. I want his name cleared." Arthur nodded slowly. "And the merger? You can't sign it. You know it's built on lies. If you sign it, you'll be just as guilty as the people who finished my dad." The word finished hung in the air between them like a poison cloud. Arthur had never said it out loud, had never allowed himself to think it directly, but they both knew what had really happened to Elijah Mercer. "They'll destroy me," Arthur said quietly. "If I don't sign, if I expose the fraud, I'll lose everything. My company, my reputation, my freedom. I'll probably go to prison." Tarek's eyes flashed with anger. "My dad lost his life. My mom lost her life. I lost my home, my family, my childhood. And you're worried about losing your money?" The words hit Arthur like a slap. He saw himself clearly for the first time in years, a man who had become so obsessed with wealth and power that he had forgotten what really mattered. "You're right," Arthur whispered. "God help me, you're absolutely right." Tarek reached into his backpack and pulled out a small, framed photograph. It showed a man in his 30s with kind eyes and a warm smile, standing next to a beautiful woman holding a baby. Arthur recognized Elijah immediately, though he looked younger and happier than Arthur had ever seen him. "This is the last picture we took together as a family," Tarek said softly. "I was 2 years old. I barely remember him, but my mom told me stories every night. She said he was the most honest man she ever knew. She said he would rather die than lie." Arthur stared at the photograph, seeing not just Elijah, but the family he had destroyed through his selfishness. A man who had died trying to do the right thing. A woman who had died in poverty because her husband's finisher had never been brought to justice. A child who had been forced to grow up too fast, to fight battles that should have been fought by adults. "I'll do it," Arthur said suddenly, his voice stronger than it had been all evening. "I'll withdraw from the merger. I'll announce an independent investigation. I'll tell the world what your father really was, a hero who died trying to save his company from fraud." Tarek's eyes filled with tears, but his voice remained steady. "And whistleblower protection? Other people need to be able to speak up without being afraid." Arthur nodded. "I'll establish a foundation in your father's name. It will provide legal protection and financial support for corporate whistleblowers. People like your father won't have to face the consequences alone." For the first time since entering the ballroom, Tarek smiled. It was a sad smile, weighted with loss and grief, but it was genuine. "Thank you," he said simply. "That's all I wanted. That's all my parents would have wanted." Arthur looked out the window one more time at the city lights, knowing that his life was about to change forever. In a few minutes he would walk back into that ballroom and destroy everything he had built. But for the first time in years, he felt something he had almost forgotten. He felt proud. Arthur and Tarek walked back into the ballroom together, an unlikely pair that commanded immediate attention. The CEO in his perfectly tailored suit, his face pale but determined, and the homeless boy in his oversized clothes, clutching a worn folder that contained the power to topple empires. The room fell silent as they approached the podium. 300 faces turned toward them, investors, reporters, board members, all waiting to see what would happen next. The merger contract still lay on the table, the golden pen beside it, gleaming under the chandelier lights like a temptation from another world. Margaret Chen rushed toward Arthur, her face twisted with panic. "Arthur, whatever you're thinking, please reconsider. Think about the shareholders, think about the employees." "I am thinking about them," Arthur said quietly, his voice carrying a new strength. "For the first time in years, I'm actually thinking about them." He stepped up to the podium, his hands no longer shaking. The cameras focused on him, broadcasting live to financial networks around the world. In a few moments, his words would trigger the largest corporate scandal in American history. But Arthur felt strangely calm. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice clear and strong, "I stand before you tonight with both an apology and a confession." The room erupted in whispers. Richard Blackwood was frantically gesturing for Arthur to stop, but Arthur ignored him. This was bigger than the board now. This was about truth. 2 years ago, a brilliant young analyst named Elijah Mercer came to me with evidence of massive fraud at Quantum Dynamics. He showed me proof that they had been falsifying their financial records, inflating their assets by billions of dollars. He begged me to stop the merger. Arthur paused, looking directly into the cameras. I dismissed his concerns. I chose profit over truth. And 3 days later, Elijah Mercer died in what was ruled an accident. The gasps from the crowd were audible. Reporters were frantically typing on their phones. Victoria Sterling was nodding slowly, a look of grim satisfaction on her face. "Tonight, Elijah's son has shown me the evidence I was too greedy to examine 2 years ago. The merger with Quantum Dynamics is built on a foundation of lies. If I were to sign this contract, I would be committing the largest securities fraud in American history." Arthur reached for the merger contract, and, to everyone's shock, tore it in half. The sound of ripping paper echoed through the silent ballroom like a gunshot. "Therefore, I am formally withdrawing Noventus Technologies from the proposed merger with Quantum Dynamics, effective immediately." The ballroom exploded into chaos. Board members were shouting. Investors were on their phones with their brokers. Reporters were pushing toward the front, trying to get closer to the story of the century. But Arthur wasn't finished. He gestured for Tarek to join him at the podium. The boy walked forward with quiet dignity, his young face solemn but proud. "This is Tarek Williams," Arthur announced, placing a protective hand on the boy's shoulder. "He is the son of Elijah Mercer, a man who died trying to save this company from its own greed. Elijah Mercer was a hero, and tonight, his son has proven that courage runs in the family." Tarek looked up at Arthur, then out at the crowd. When he spoke, his voice was clear and strong, carrying the weight of his father's legacy. "My dad always said that the truth was worth dying for," Tarek said into the microphone. "Tonight, Mr. Keene proved that the truth is also worth living for." Arthur nodded, then looked back at the cameras. "Effective immediately, I am establishing the Elijah Mercer Foundation for Corporate Whistleblower Protection. This foundation will provide legal representation and financial support for employees who risk their careers to expose corporate fraud. Never again should someone have to choose between their conscience and their life." The questions from reporters came like machine gun fire, but Arthur held up his hand for silence. "I know that my decision tonight will have serious consequences. The SEC will investigate. There will be lawsuits. Some of you will lose money because of my choices. But for the first time in 2 years, I can look at myself in the mirror without shame." He turned to Tarek, his voice soft but audible through the microphone. "Your father would be proud of you. You've accomplished what he couldn't. You've made the truth impossible to ignore." Tarek smiled, tears streaming down his young face. "He would be proud of you too, Mr. Keene. You did the right thing." As security moved to escort them safely from the chaos, Arthur realized that the boy was right. He had lost billions of dollars. He would probably face criminal charges. His reputation was destroyed. But in saving himself from becoming a fraud, he had found something far more valuable than money. He had found his soul. 6 months later, the Elijah Mercer Foundation had protected 17 whistleblowers from corporate retaliation. Quantum Dynamics executives were in federal prison. And Tarek Williams was living in a comfortable home, funded by Arthur's personal fortune, attending the best schools in New York. Sometimes the most expensive signatures are the ones you don't make. And sometimes, a homeless boy's courage can save more than just a company. It can save a man's conscience.